You already know where religion comes from. Everyone does. It's one of those stories so familiar that nobody bothers to say it out loud anymore, because it feels less like a theory and more like simple common sense. The story goes like this. First, human beings figured out farming. They stopped wandering, planted seeds, settled down in one place, and began producing more food than they immediately needed. That surplus allowed some people to stop farming entirely and do other things instead. Some of those people became chiefs. Some became soldiers, and some became priests. Cities grew. Populations swelled into the thousands, and then the tens of thousands. And managing that many strangers living shoulder to shoulder required something more powerful than family loyalty to hold them together. It required shared beliefs, shared rules, shared gods watching from above to make sure everyone behaved. Religion, in this telling, is a technology of civilization. It arrives late, near the end of the human story, invented by settled people who needed a way to organize crowds. Temples come after granaries. Gods come after kings. Faith is the byproduct of agriculture and crowds and the specific problems of city life. It's a clean story. It's a satisfying story. It puts everything in a sensible order, with each piece arriving exactly when you'd expect it to, building neatly toward the world we recognize. And there is a place in southeastern Turkey, sitting on a dusty limestone ridge overlooking the plains where some of the very first farming on Earth would eventually take root. That takes this entire clean and satisfying story and quietly sets it on fire. The site is called Göbekli Tepe. The name means Potbelly Hill in Turkish, a reference to the rounded mound that, for thousands of years, looked like nothing more than an unremarkable bump in the landscape. Local farmers knew there were old stones buried up there. Bits of carved rock would surface when they plowed, and they assumed reasonably that it was a medieval cemetery or the ruins of some forgotten church, the kind of thing that turns up all over that ancient and much conquered part of the world. For decades, that's what everyone assumed. A survey team even visited in the 1960s, noted some broken limestone slabs, and moved on, recording it as probably nothing of importance. The hill kept its secret for another 30 years. And then, in the 1990s, archaeologists began to dig in earnest. What they pulled out of that hill did not match anything that was supposed to exist. Massive pillars of stone, T-shaped, some of them standing over 5 meters tall and weighing as much as 10 tons, carved with extraordinary care and arranged deliberately into great rings. The pillars were covered in animals: foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, wild boars, all rendered in relief by someone who clearly knew exactly what they were doing. The carvings sophisticated and confident and unmistakably intentional. These were not rough scratchings. This was monumental architecture. This was a site built on purpose, at enormous cost by people who had gathered together to raise something that had nothing to do with shelter or food storage, and everything to do with meaning. And here is the detail that should stop you cold, the single fact that breaks the comfortable story into pieces. Göbekli Tepe is roughly 11,500 years old. It was built before agriculture, before pottery, before writing, before metal, before the wheel, before the domestication of a single animal or plant. It was built before the granaries it was supposed to come after, before the cities it was supposed to serve, before the kings it was supposed to flatter. The people who quarried those 10-ton pillars, who carved those animals, who dragged that stone into position and raised those rings on that hill, were hunter-gatherers. They did not farm. They followed game and gathered wild plants and lived by every assumption of the clean story, the kind of hand-to-mouth existence that supposedly leaves no time, no surplus, and no reason for cathedrals. And yet there it is, a monument to something sacred, built thousands of years too early by exactly the people who weren't supposed to be capable of it. So either the story we all know is wrong, or there is something deeply strange going on here. And the answer, as it turns out, is both. Let me pull the thread. The first thing the clean story gets wrong is the most obvious thing, the assumption sitting right at its foundation. The story assumes that building something monumental requires a settled, hierarchical agricultural society, because monuments take organization, and organization takes the kind of stratified society that only farming can support. You need someone to plan it. You need a workforce that can be fed while they labor instead of hunting. You need leadership that can command, coordinate, and sustain an effort across months or years. All of that, the story insists, is downstream of agriculture. No farms, no surplus, no surplus, no spare labor, no spare labor, no temples. The logic feels airtight. Göbekli Tepe demolishes it. The construction of that site represents a staggering amount of coordinated human effort. Moving a 10-ton pillar without wheels, without draft animals, without metal tools, using nothing but stone implements, rope, levers, ramps, and the muscle of a large number of people working in concert, is not a casual undertaking. It would have required dozens, possibly hundreds of individuals laboring together, and it would have required someone to feed all of them while they worked. Researchers studying the site have found enormous quantities of animal bone, the remains of vast feasts, gazelle and aurochs and wild boar consumed in numbers that point to large gatherings of people coming together at this spot, eating in great communal meals, and then raising stone. This was a hunter-gatherer society organizing a workforce, sustaining it, and directing it toward a monumental goal, all without the agricultural surplus that was supposed to be the precondition for any of it, which means the precondition was never the surplus at all. It was the desire. These people did not build because they had become rich enough to afford a temple. They built because they wanted to badly enough that they figured out how to afford it. The motivation came first, and the organization followed the motivation, rather than the other way around. And that is stranger than it sounds, because it inverts the relationship between wealth and worship that we take completely for granted. We assume people build sacred places when they can spare the resources. Göbekli Tepe suggests that sometimes people find the resources because they cannot bear not to build the sacred place. The need was the engine. Everything else was just the machinery the need assembled around itself. But if you think 11,500 years is the beginning of this story, you are not even close. Because the impulse that raised those pillars did not appear out of nowhere on that Turkish hilltop. It has roots that run down, and down, and down, far deeper into the human past than the comfortable story ever wanted to look. Pull the thread further and the bottom keeps dropping out beneath you. Long before anyone carved a single pillar, human beings were already doing something that no purely practical animal has any reason to do. They were burying their dead with care, and not just covering a body to keep scavengers away or to mask the smell, which would be the practical explanation, the one that requires no inner life at all. They were arranging the dead deliberately, positioning the body, and placing things alongside it. Things the dead person could not use, because the dead person was dead. At a site called Sungir, in what is now Russia, archaeologists uncovered burials dating back roughly 34,000 years, and what they found alongside the bodies is almost difficult to comprehend. Thousands upon thousands of beads, each one painstakingly carved from mammoth ivory, sewn onto clothing in such quantity that producing them would have taken thousands of hours of skilled labor. Ivory bracelets, carved pendants, spears made from straightened mammoth tusk, a feat of craftsmanship we still don't fully understand how they accomplished. An entire fortune of human effort, buried in the ground with the dead, never to be recovered, never to be used again by anyone. Think about what that actually means. Producing those grave goods cost an extraordinary investment from a community that had no labor to waste, a community for whom every hour spent carving beads was an hour, not spent hunting, gathering, or preparing for the brutal winters of Ice Age Europe. And they spent it anyway. They spent thousands of hours of irreplaceable labor to dress their dead and send them into the ground in splendor. You do not do that for a corpse you believe is simply meat that has stopped moving. You do that for someone you believe is going somewhere. You do that when you think the dead still matter, still continue, still require things on the other side of a threshold you cannot see across. This is not proof of a god, not yet, not in the sense of a named deity with a face and a temple, but it is unmistakable evidence of something just as significant. It is evidence that these people lived inside a world layered with meaning, a world where death was a passage rather than an ending, where the unseen was real enough to spend a fortune on. And it goes back further still. Tens of thousands of years before Sungir, human beings were collecting and using red ochre, a pigment with no nutritional value and no obvious practical purpose, grinding it, processing it, carrying it sometimes over long distances, and using it to mark themselves, their objects, and their dead. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, researchers found pieces of ochre engraved with deliberate cross-hatched patterns, dating back as much as 70 to 100,000 years, alongside shell beads pierced and worn as ornament. Patterns that mean nothing you can eat, nothing you can hunt with, nothing that keeps you warm or dry. Patterns that exist purely to mean. The red of ochre is the red of blood, and across a staggering range of human cultures, separated by oceans and tens of thousands of years, that color attaches itself to death, to ritual, to the body, to the boundary between the living and whatever lies beyond. We cannot read the minds of the people who ground that ochre, but we can see written in the residue they left behind that they were already living symbolic lives, already reaching past the literal world in front of them towards something the literal world could not contain. And now we arrive at the part that almost nobody tells you, the part that makes the deepest version of this story genuinely unsettling. Because if symbolic behavior, if care for the dead, if the marking of the sacred runs this far back into the human past, then we have to confront a possibility the clean story was specifically designed to avoid. We have to consider that it might predate our own species entirely. The Neanderthals were not us. They were a separate kind of human, a cousin lineage that split from our ancestors hundreds of thousands of years ago and developed along its own path, with its own bodies, its own tools, and, it increasingly appears, its own inner world. For a long time, the popular image of the Neanderthal was the ultimate brute, the shambling caveman of cartoons, all instinct and no soul. That image is dead, and it deserved to die. At sites across Europe and the Middle East, there is evidence that Neanderthals, too, buried their dead. At Shanidar Cave in Iraq, a Neanderthal was laid to rest in a way that some researchers have argued was deliberate and considered, the body positioned with apparent intention. There is debate about every individual case, fierce debate, because the evidence is ancient and fragmentary and easy to misread, and serious scientists disagree about how much weight any single burial can bear. But the pattern, taken as a whole, is hard to dismiss. These other humans, these cousins who were not our ancestors, appear to have looked at death and responded to it with something more than indifference, which raises a question that should genuinely send a chill down your spine. If both our lineage and theirs, branches that separated hundreds of thousands of years ago, independently arrived at the practice of honoring the dead, then where did that impulse actually come from? Did each lineage invent it separately? Or did both inherit it from a common ancestor older than either of them, meaning the roots of the sacred reach down past the origin of modern humanity itself, into a shared inheritance we can barely glimpse? We do not know. The honest answer is that we cannot currently know. But the question alone is enough to permanently dislodge the comfortable story from its foundations. Religion as a late invention of city life, a clever tool dreamed up to manage crowds, simply cannot survive contact with this evidence. The reaching toward meaning, the sense that the world is more than it appears, the conviction that the dead are not simply gone. All of it was already ancient, already deep, already woven into how human beings, and possibly human-adjacent beings, experienced existence, tens of thousands of years before the first seed was ever deliberately planted in the ground. So, let's go back up to that hill in Turkey, because now we can see Göbekli Tepe for what it really is, and we can ask the question that flips the entire human story upside down. The clean story said agriculture came first and religion came second, a luxury that settled, well-fed people could finally afford. But Göbekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers before agriculture, which means the order is wrong. The temple came before the farm. And once you accept that the temple came first, a genuinely revolutionary possibility opens up, an idea that some researchers studying the site have proposed, and that, true or not, is one of the most provocative ideas in all of modern archaeology. What if it wasn't agriculture that gave birth to religion? What if it was religion that gave birth to agriculture? Follow the logic, because it's extraordinary. To build something like Göbekli Tepe, you need a lot of people in one place for an extended period, and you need to feed them all. Hunter-gatherers, by their nature, move in small bands and disperse across the landscape following the food. But the gravitational pull of a sacred site, a place worth gathering at, worth building, worth returning to, could draw people together in numbers and concentrations that the old wandering way of life never produced. And once you have hundreds of people gathering at one spot, again and again, year after year, to build and to feast and to worship, you have created a problem. You have to feed all of them reliably in one location, far more food than the surrounding wild landscape can easily provide on demand. And right there, in exactly the region where Göbekli Tepe stands, in those very same hills, grow the wild ancestors of some of the first domesticated grains on Earth. Wild wheat, wild barley, the raw material of farming, growing on the doorstep of the temple. The hypothesis writes itself. The need to feed the gatherings at the sacred site may have been precisely the pressure that pushed people to begin managing, tending, and ultimately domesticating those wild grasses. Not because they dreamed of becoming farmers, not because someone had a clever idea about surplus in cities, but because they had built a God's house, and now they had to keep the worshippers fed. In this telling, the entire revolution that produced civilization, the shift from foraging to farming that reshaped the planet and everything on it, was not driven by the search for food or comfort or security. It was driven by the need to sustain something sacred. The pyramids of grain, the granaries, the cities, the kings, all of it, the whole towering edifice of the human world, may have grown not from the belly but from the spirit. We did not build temples because we became civilized. We may have become civilized because we built temples. Now, I want to be careful and honest here, because this is the part where a lot of channels would overstate things, and you deserve better than that. This causal story, religion driving agriculture rather than the reverse, is a hypothesis. It is not proven, and reputable archaeologists argue about it, and newer findings have complicated the original picture, including evidence that people may have actually lived at Göbekli Tepe, rather than only worshipping there, which muddies the clean image of a pure temple. The full truth is probably messier than any single tidy narrative, including this one. But here is what is not in dispute, what no amount of scholarly argument can erase. Monumental sacred architecture was being raised by hunter-gatherers thousands of years before the agricultural society that was supposed to be its precondition. That fact is solid. That fact stands. And that fact, all on its own, is enough to prove that the sacred did not arrive at the end of the human story as a finishing touch. It was there near the beginning, doing the heavy lifting, possibly steering the whole thing. And here is what should genuinely astonish you. This isn't a one-off. This isn't a single weird anomaly on a single Turkish hill that we can file away as an exception and forget. Because once you start looking, the pattern appears everywhere, across the entire planet, among peoples who had no contact with one another whatsoever, separated by oceans and continents and tens of thousands of years. Across the Americas, peoples who never met anyone from the old world built mounds, raised monuments, aligned structures to the movements of the sun and stars, and buried their dead with elaborate ritual. Across Australia, whose aboriginal peoples have maintained one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, an entire sophisticated cosmology, a web of sacred sites, ancestral beings, and law encoded in the landscape itself, developed over tens of thousands of years in complete isolation from the rest of humanity. Across Europe, hunter-gatherers and early farmers painted the depths of caves with images that plunge, by the most reliable dating, back more than 30,000 years, in places like Chauvet, where the walls erupt with lions and horses and rhinos, rendered with a skill that would not embarrass a modern artist. These cave paintings sit deep underground, in chambers far from where anyone lived, in places that took real effort and real risk to reach, lit by guttering flame. And many researchers believe they were never meant as decoration at all, but as something closer to ritual, to vision, to a deliberate descent into the dark to meet whatever waited there, in every corner of the inhabited world, among people who could not possibly have copied one another. The same thing emerges again and again. Humans mark the dead. Humans make the sacred. Humans build and paint and bury and align their monuments to the heavens and reach, always reach, past the visible world towards something they cannot see but cannot stop believing in. This was not one brilliant culture inventing religion and slowly spreading it across the globe through trade and migration. This was dozens upon dozens of unrelated human populations, scattered across every continent, independently arriving at the same fundamental orientation toward existence. And when something appears independently that many times, in that many separate places among people with no connection to each other, it stops looking like a cultural invention that some societies happen to come up with. It starts looking like something else entirely. It starts looking like a feature of the human animal itself, which brings us to the deepest layer of this whole question. The part that the clean story was most determined to keep buried, because it touches something uncomfortable about what we are. If the reaching toward the sacred is this old, this deep, this universal, appearing in every human population and possibly in human species other than our own, then it cannot be a mistake, a glitch, a superstition that clever people eventually grow out of. It is too consistent for that. It is too deeply woven into the species, and that forces a genuinely difficult conclusion. The capacity for the sacred, the need to find meaning beyond the literal, the refusal to accept that the dead are simply gone, and the world is simply matter, may be as fundamental to human beings as language, as tool-making, as the bonds of family. It may be one of the things that makes us human in the first place, rather than something we tacked on later once we had the leisure to invent it. This is the part that almost no one wants to say plainly. So let me say it plainly. We did not invent the sacred because we became sophisticated. We may have become sophisticated because we were already, from very near the beginning, the kind of creature that perceives the sacred. The temple is not a late flowering on the tree of human achievement. The temple may be closer to the root. So, let's finally answer the question we started with. Did prehistoric people believe in gods? The honest answer is that we cannot reach across that enormous gulf of time and read the specific contents of their minds. We do not know the names they gave to the unseen, or the stories they told about it, or whether what they felt would map neatly onto the word God, as you understand it today, with all the particular shapes that word has taken in the religions you happen to have grown up around. Belief is invisible. It does not fossilize. It leaves no bones. But belief leaves behind something else. It leaves behind 10-ton pillars dragged up a hill by people who had no reason to drag them, except that something compelled them to. It leaves behind thousands of ivory beads sewn onto the dead by a community that could not spare the labor, and spent it anyway, because they could not bear to send their loved ones into the ground unadorned. It leaves behind ground ochre the color of blood, smeared across 100,000 years of human existence. It leaves behind painted lions in the lightless heart of the earth, and aligned stones tracking the wheel of the heavens, and graves arranged with a tenderness that says, as clearly as anything ancient can say, "We do not believe you are simply gone." The behavior is the belief, made visible, and the behavior is everywhere. And it is staggeringly old, older than farming, older than cities, older than writing, older perhaps than our species itself. The first humans were not waiting for civilization to hand them the sacred. They were already drenched in it. They carried it with them across every continent they walked into. They built their first great works in its name, before they built anything else at all. The reaching toward something beyond the visible world is not a chapter near the end of the human story. It is written into the very first pages, possibly into the pages that come before the human story even begins, which leaves one last thought, and it's about us, sitting here now on the far side of all those millennia, in a world of glass and steel and glowing screens, a world that likes to think of itself as having grown up and left all of that behind. We tell ourselves a story about ourselves too. We tell ourselves that we are the rational ones, the secular ones, the ones who finally outgrew the need to fill the dark with gods. We tell ourselves that the reaching is over, that we have replaced it with science and certainty, and the cold comfort of a universe that means nothing in particular. And maybe that's true. But the impulse that raised those pillars on that hill 11,500 years ago did not come from ignorance, and it did not come from fear of the dark, and it did not come from a failure to understand the world. It came from somewhere far deeper than that, somewhere that has been part of us for as long as there has been in us. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were not waiting for the truth to set them free from their gods. They were us. And we have never once, in all the long history of our kind, stopped reaching for the thing on the other side of the stars. The only question worth asking is whether we ever actually will.